Good afternoon. My name is Eli Hardy-Howes. Can you please tell me your full name?
Hello, sir. My full name is Timur.
And what should I call you?
You can just call me Tim if you like.
Okay. Now, Tim, in this first part, I'd like to ask you some questions about yourself. Are you a student or do you work?
Well, actually, I'm a university student and I've been studying at university for 5 years now. So I'm about to graduate in several months.
And what subject are you studying?
Well, I study geology, and I think that it's very interesting science for me. I find it very fascinating to learn about the planet Earth and about those magnificent creatures who lived on our planet many million years ago.
Um, have you been studying this subject for a long time?
Well, to be honest, we didn't study geology at school, so I've been studying geology since I started university, basically only 5 years by now.
Mm-hmm. What do you like most about this subject?
Well, for me, the best part about geology, like I mentioned before, is the fact that it's a very fascinating and interesting science. You know, it's really fascinating to learn about the creatures that lived on the planet Earth many years ago and about, the processes that occurs on this planet.
Let's move on. Let's talk about television. How often do you watch television?
Well, let me see. To be honest, in this day and age, I don't watch much television because, well, actually, I love watching movies, but if I do watch a movie, I prefer to do it on my phone or maybe on my computer.
Why?
Well, actually, I think that it's much better. You know, it's just on the whole, it's a better viewing experience because the quality is much better and the speakers on my TV have an awful sound. That's why I don't even watch TV.
Do you prefer watching television alone or with other people?
Well, to be totally upfront, I prefer watching television alone because that way I can concentrate on watching movie, for example, better, so that there is no background noise and nobody distracts me.
Would you like to be on television?
Oh no, to be honest, I think that I wouldn't have the stomach to speak in public. And on top of that, I think that my acting skills leave a lot to be desired.
Let's move on. Let's talk about clothing brands. What kind of clothing brands do you like best?
Well, to be honest, I've never been fashion conscious and I don't know a lot about fashion. But if I had to choose one, I think I would go for Levi's or maybe Hugo Boss. I love Hugo Boss suits. I think they're very, good quality and they look very just great.
Hmm. Which is more important to you, the brand or design of the clothes you wear?
Well, definitely design is a prime concern for me
Mhm.
because for me, brand is just a name, right? And the only thing that I can get from the brand is to show off my status. But
Mhm.
design is really important because it makes me look better
Mhm.
and feel more confident.
Would you ever spend a lot of money on clothes designed by a famous designer?
Definitely not. It's just not worth it for me. And even if I were rich, I don't think I would, splash out on famous brand clothes. I would, probably I would go for good quality clothes, not cheap, but I wouldn't, fork out for expensive brands.
Okay, now we're going to move on to part 2 of the test. And in this part, I'm going to give you a topic and I'd like you to talk about it for 1 to 2 minutes. And before you talk, you'll have 1 minute to think about what you're going to say, and you can make some notes if you wish. Do you understand?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Can you see your topic?
Yes, I can.
Okay, you have 1 minute to prepare. All right, Tim. Now remember, you have 1 to 2 minutes for this, so don't worry if I stop you. I'll tell you when the time is up. Can you start speaking now, please?
Well, I'd like to describe a famous Russian book, and it's none other than War and Peace. Well, for starters, talking about who wrote this book, it's a famous Russian writer whose name is Lev Tolstoy. Moving on to how I first came across this book. Well, I first came across this book a couple of years ago, actually. Even though it's very famous, we didn't read it at school because it's quite difficult reading. And basically, this book is all about the Russian society during the time of Napoleon Wars. That was about 200 years ago. And actually, it was my father who recommended me to read this book. And for me, this is the business. As far as I'm concerned, War and Peace is a quintessential Russian book because it describes, the Russian people, our characters, and on top of that, Lev Tolstoy is writing about the rustic charm of a quintessential Russian village. And when you read this book, you just you get a taste for Russia, for the countryside of Russia, and that's why I really love it. And also, this book, it has a great deal about philosophy. There are many philosophical questions that you have to rack your brains about. And on the whole, I would say that this book, changed my outlook on the Russian society and, on the world as well.
Okay,
So
thank you. Would you recommend this book to other people?
yes, definitely, I would recommend this book to others people, and actually, I did recommend it to many of my friends, and especially to foreigners, right? Because in Russia, almost everyone has read this book. It's just very popular.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to move on to part 3. And in part 3, I'm going to ask you 1 or 2 more questions related to the theme of your topic. So let's first of all consider reading non-fiction books, so factual books. Why do you think people like to read non-fiction books?
Well, to be honest, I wouldn't agree with this statement. As far as I'm concerned, many people don't really like reading non-fictional books. And for example, me, I just hate it. I prefer fiction actually. But those who like it, I'd hazard a guess that it may well be that they, just enjoy gain knowledge, right? And learning about specific things. Some maybe sectors, economic sector, for example. It just helps them in their job, and that's why they enjoy reading it because they believe it will help them
Do
in
you
the
think
future.
that books are better than, say, other mediums for learning knowledge? So, would books, for example, on a topic be better than watching a documentary about that topic?
Yes, I would say that books are much better for gaining knowledge than reading documentaries, because first and foremost, when you read book, you can read this information many times, right?
Mhm.
And it's just more convenient to go back and read some article. It's much easier than watch the documentary again.
Mm.
And on top of that, I think that when we write things down, it's just easier to take in information through reading rather than through watching and listening. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's my opinion.
Um, let's move on. Let's talk about the power of books. And you talked about War and Peace, which is a very powerful book. Why do you think it is that some people can read these powerful books and end up with a different interpretation of the book?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's because it's down to the fact that all the people have different backgrounds, right?
Mhm.
And everyone has a different outlook, and that's why when they read this book, they kind of make different conclusions. And for example, I know that many of my friends, when they read this book, they didn't like reading about war. They would focus on reading about peace, about peaceful times.
Mm.
And me, on the contrary, I would rather focus on war. On the battles, on the description of battles. It was much more interesting for me.
Mm. Why do you think there are certain books that have been banned over time by governments?
Well, mostly I think it's down to political reasons. And for example, if some book, um, tries to agitate, tries to promote certain ideas, for example, about changing a regime or something, then the government may think that it might be dangerous for the citizens to read that kind of literature because it may push them to do a mutiny, for example, to become rebellious, and that's why many books get banned. But of course, there are just many inappropriate books that are no good, right? And that's why I think the governments of most countries would ban them because they just inappropriate for people, especially for youngsters.
So, do you think that the government should have the power to ban books that they deem inappropriate?
Well, I think that it's a really controversial question because, first and foremost, nowadays we have a tendency, well, many countries try to, set democracy, right? And of course, totalitarianism is not good. And usually, the governments that are totally monarchy, for example, or mm, you know,
Mm.
well, I mean that democratic governments, they are not supposed to restrict literature. They're not supposed to ban books. It's usually that is what usually totalitarianism regime does. So I think that they shouldn't do it.
Thank you very much. That is the end of the speaking test.
Okay, thank
So
you very
Timur,
much.
how did it feel?
Oh, to be honest, I felt that in part two, I kind of, uh, get lost in the structure. I mean, I didn't really use my 1 minute for preparation. I didn't use it effectively. I hadn't made a good structure for my answer, and that's why I spoke for like 1 minute, and then I was getting lost in my answer. I was thinking, what should I tell next? And so on. And in part three, uh, the last question was quite tricky for me because I couldn't explain. I lacked vocabulary. I didn't have enough vocabulary to answer the last question. I
Yeah.
meant that democratic countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, they don't usually ban books, right? Because we people have rights, and it's just not what they usually do
Yeah.
because
So
it's
that was a very, very difficult question that I asked you at the end there.
yeah.
And the reason I did that is because in your IELTS speaking test, you're likely to get a very difficult question in part three, because you're definitely above band 7. You said at the beginning of this that you're aiming for band 7. Well, you're definitely already above band 7. So that's
Okay.
great. You're band 7.5, band 8. And I think it will depend on the speaking test. Certainly, it struck me that you were closer to band 8. And then the 2 points that you picked up on as not being so strong, like the second part of part 2 and the last question of part 3, made me think actually maybe slightly closer to 7.5. But until that point, until the last part of part 3, I was thinking band 8. So you're borderline band 7.5, band 8. And I think, you said you've got 5 months more until you actually do the IELTS speaking test. So I think with a bit more practice, and especially some conversations like this on difficult topics, you could definitely be getting band 8 in the speaking test, which would be very impressive.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. I really
And
appreciate it.
yeah, and so what we'll do is we'll go through each part individually, and we'll start with part 1. So in part 1, it became pretty apparent that you're very comfortable speaking English, and you've got very high accuracy actually in your grammar. You speak at quite a kind of steady pace. You don't speak too quickly and you don't speak too slowly. And it seems like you pay quite a lot of attention to the accuracy of your English. That was the immediate impression I got from even the first few questions in part 1. And that was great to see. So you used, for example, the present perfect and the present perfect continuous perfectly, when you were describing what you study and how long you've been studying for. So that was great to see. And that's exactly what I was looking out for at the beginning. You also had a lot of very nice ways to refer back to what you were talking about and organize your speech. Things like I mentioned before, and on the whole. And these as well, these cohesive devices will stick out to an examiner, and you use them very well throughout the entire speaking test, in part 1, part 2, and in part 3. Although sometimes you repeat some of them quite regularly, especially actually. You say actually a lot. And you also, I think, maybe repeated on the whole a few times, but that's okay. So I liked the vocabulary in part 1. I liked fascinating. I liked peers. I really liked background noise. We also had some phrases that struck me as a little bit odd. So one of them was "in this day and age." So I asked you if you watch TV, and you said "in this day and age." So we usually use "in this day and age" when we're describing something much bigger. So for example, in this day and age, books are still being banned, like as in that's a very controversial topic. But you wouldn't really say in this day and age, I watch television or I don't watch television. So I was saying maybe in this day and age wasn't really the right phrase to use. It's a great phrase, but you would use it for more of a kind of grand statement than answering a personal question about watching television. You also said to be upfront as well, which is again a nice phrase, but used slightly incorrectly. If you want to say to be upfront, it's like you're giving me maybe bad news or news that I would find difficult to hear. Whereas you said to be upfront, I don't like wearing fashionable brands. And it seemed a bit strange to say, like it's a bit like saying, I don't mean to offend you, but I don't like fashionable brands. I go, okay, don't worry, I'm not offended. So, maybe instead of saying to be upfront, you could say to be honest, which is a slightly more kind of casual phrase that we can use when we're just describing aspects of our personality. When we were talking about clothing, I really liked your phrase fashion conscious, which is a great collocation and a really nice phrasal verb to show off your status. When I was hearing this, I was like, good stuff. Talking about how designer brands aren't worth it. So to be worth it. You also said that you don't like to splash out. So another very nice phrasal verb. Again, fork out, which is similar to splash out. So that's very powerful because you're showing two similar phrasal verbs and you're showing that you can demonstrate the use of both of them in the same context, which is appropriate. Very nice. And I also really liked the conditional sentence about even if I were rich, I wouldn't spend a lot of money on designer brands. So that really stood out as high-level grammar, especially because you used it accurately. There was a little bit of hesitation when you were talking about Hugo Boss. You said, Hugo Boss just looks great. So there's like that kind of a bit of a pause. And then the adjective you chose was kind of quite a simple adjective. So I wasn't really sure what was going on there.
I was thinking about vocabulary, which is not good.
Right. And then, yeah, okay, I see. So that little things like that, you know, are very normal. But because you're such a high level student, the examiner is going to be noticing and picking up on a lot of these different, you know, just tiny micro pauses in your speech. Just because they're going to be thinking, wait a second, is Tim band 9? And so as soon as that kind of thought goes into the examiner's head, they need to really, really pay attention, because if they find any of that hesitation, then they're thinking, okay, probably band 8. And then we had part 2, and I really liked the beginning. You said for starters, which is great. Moving on to, like as you were going through the questions. You also said things like, even though we didn't So those kind of using even though as a linking expression in subordinate clauses gets you a high score for grammar. Very nice. Quintessential, very, very nice. Rustic charm. Rack your brain, loads of really nice idioms. And we had on the whole again, which I still like, although we are getting a bit of repetition here. A little thing, you described your favorite with this book, was it War and Peace, about as the bee's knees. It's a bit, I don't know if you would describe such a kind of classic book as the bee's knees. To be honest, the bee's knees is a bit of a kind of outdated phrase that we don't use so often. And if we were to use it, we would use it in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way. So we would say, it would almost be like we would use it in a way to kind of make fun of something that's meant to be really important. Whereas if something is really important, like a classic piece of literature, we wouldn't use the phrase bee's knees. Does that make sense?
Yeah, probably it is second to none would be better.
Yeah, second to none would be great. And quintessential, you said quintessential Russian literature, that was brilliant as well, but maybe not the bee's knees.
Okay.
Pronunciation of village. Did you
Village.
village? Okay, that's fine. Yeah, it just sounded like you weren't. I wasn't sure whether I heard a village or village. I wasn't sure whether I had a V sound or a W sound, but that's fine. Village. Sometimes you miss out articles, but not very regularly. But you missed out one, for example, you said during Napoleon Wars, and it would probably be in English, it'd be during the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, so just putting the article, the Napoleonic Wars. You also added an S, you said others people instead of other people in the follow-up question. Now, remember, when you answer a follow-up question at the end of part 2, you can just give a very short answer. So you can just say yes or no. You don't have to give a very long answer in the follow-up question.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
I thought that I'm supposed to speak like for 30 seconds at least.
In part 1, yes. In part 2, well, we need to speak for 2 minutes. And then in part 3, yes. But the follow-up question at the end of part 2, you can just give a short answer. Usually what you'll find is if you start giving too long an answer in the follow-up question, then the examiner will interrupt you and move you on. So feel free just to give a short answer and not elaborate too much. And you said that you found it difficult to structure your part 2. Quite a good idea is to tell a story in part 2. So, for example, if you were to tell a story, you could start with how you found out about the book, when you read it, and then, as you could progress through your story, you can talk about who the main characters are, what happens to them briefly, how you felt when you were reading the book, how you felt when you finished the book, who you've given the book to, who you've recommended it to, and who you've talked about the book to. So do you see it kind of follows a logical story? And when we frame part 2 as a logical story, it becomes a lot easier to talk for 2 minutes and to not repeat ourselves as well.
Yeah, I should have done it definitely.
Well, you've got 5 months to practice, so lots of time there. And especially because you've already got such a high level vocabulary, you've got 5 months just to kind of finesse all the little details so that you do really, really well in the speaking test. In part 3, I love the fact that in the first question, you didn't agree with me, which is great. I love that. You said, I wouldn't agree. And I was like, oh, great. When I think I asked you about, do people like to read why do people like to read non-fiction books? You said, well, I wouldn't agree that people like to read non-fiction books. And then you explained why, which is really, really good. So stuff like that is really nice. It makes the conversation more alive. I really like the phrase, as far as I'm concerned. At one point, I think you said reading documentaries instead of watching documentaries.
Yeah, might be.
It was maybe like a small slip, and I kind of went like I wasn't sure. But then later on, you corrected it, and I heard you saying watching documentaries, so I knew it was just a small slip, but just something to pay attention to. I really like the phrase again, first and foremost. And you were talking about different backgrounds, different outlooks, and what's this? Oh, and you said make a conclusion, and we'd probably say reach a conclusion. Yeah.
I just didn't know the collocation.
Right. Yeah. Case. So reach a conclusion, not make a conclusion. I love the phrase again, it's down to political reasons. Very nice. And also agitate and also promote ideas. Very nice. The kind of literature. Very nice. And then a small mistake, you said do a mutiny. We wouldn't do a mutiny. So again, a collocation mistake. We'd probably commit mutiny.
Commit mutiny.
Yeah, commit mutiny, because it's kind of like a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and I liked also a controversial and have a tendency. But then finally in part 3, just at the end, when I was asking those really difficult questions, there was a little bit of hesitation, and that will lower your score a little bit. And what you'll find is the examiner will want to test how good your English is. So you're likely to get very difficult questions at the end of part 3. So just be ready for them. Keep some
I
energy
should
for
have
the
been
end of
more
part 3.
accurate. I think I should have chosen, another way answering the last question, because, I should have realized in the beginning that I don't have the vocabulary to answer it that way that I wanted in my head.
Well, that's a good point. Sometimes even if it's something you believe in, you go, wait a second, I don't know how to communicate this. And then you give yourself a different idea instead.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, the best way to get better at that is to have deep and difficult conversations with friends or with a teacher in English. And that way you start to realize what you can communicate and what you need more vocabulary to communicate as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Couldn't agree more.
Great. Do you have any questions about the speaking test?
No, actually, I can only say that I liked it very much. Thank you very much for providing this opportunity. And
It was
it's
a
just
real
great.
it was a real pleasure to speak to you, Tim. And I'm going to send you a PDF of difficult part 3 questions that you can practice either with a teacher or with a friend or even just by yourself, just to get you ready for those difficult questions that you'll probably get in May in your speaking test.
It would be very kind.
Okay, great. I'll do that now. All right, lovely speaking to you, Tim. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye then.